So we want to spend a lot of our energy today really thinking about and worshiping God and really trying to understand His Word. And we're going to talk about something important today. You know, as we think about the sermon series that we're in, and we're talking about having a heart that can hear, one of the things that is really difficult for us is dealing with failure. And I don't know about you guys, but when I look back through my life and I look at some of the times where it seems like I've failed in significant ways, it's not hard to lose hope. Or it's one of the things that we really have to struggle with is when we're facing failure, and especially if you've had multiple failures, is you can start to see yourself as a failure. You can start to see maybe even like Job, as we're going through our Sunday school class on the book of Job, that you start to think that God doesn't care about you, and you start to lose hope when you deal with failure over and over again. And I think that a lot of us have that in us. I was listening to a pastor talk about how he felt like in the church that the feeling of failure, because there is a goal for us, there is a standard for us, we have this view of sin, and we have this view of righteousness and holiness, and that most Christians, when they look at that and they look at their lives, they feel like a failure. And so we want to talk today about failure, because one of the things that is important for us to understand, that if your heart doesn't hear God in terms of dealing with failure, it can affect your heart hearing God on a lot of different ways. You start losing the ability to hear the love of God for you because you feel like all you do is fail, and you feel like He could not possibly love you because of the failure that you are. And so we want to look at that today, and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26, verse 73 through 75 today. So if you want to turn there, we'll be there in just a minute. I want you to imagine, though, as we get started, imagine a car company came to you and said, "We want to give you a car to drive. And you're not going to have to pay a cent for it. In fact, we'll even cover the insurance. And you will not make a single payment. It will be yours to drive and put as many miles on it as you want to. Not only that, any licensed driver that you know, you can just hand the keys to them and they can drive. You have a 16-year-old kid at home, just hand them the keys and let them drive it. Drive it as much as you want. And not only that, but if anything breaks on the car, we're going to fix it for you for free, immediately." Wouldn't that be a great deal? How many of you guys would sign up for that deal? This actually happened in the 60s, where a car company did that. And not only was it any kind of car, it was a prototype that was so advanced that it was like something out of the space age. This car had a power plant, a kind of motor that was completely different from any other car on the road. This motor was so smooth that you could set a nickel on it on edge while it was running, and it would not fall, the nickel would not fall over. That's how smooth it was. Not only that, but this engine was completely maintenance-free. Well, not completely. You had to change one spark plug every 50,000 miles or so. Sound like a pretty good deal? Yeah, it was a fantastic deal. Not only that, but they had spent over 20 years researching, designing, and developing this engine. It was completely the most advanced engine on the road. And they put it in a car that was designed and hand-built in Italy. And the body of the car itself cost over $250,000 in today's money. They're going to put that car, that engine, give you a car to drive. That's what they did. Chrysler did that in the 60s. It was called the turbine car. Has anybody ever heard of this? The Chrysler turbine car. It had a turbine, basically a jet engine in it. And they gave this 200 people, 200 families across the United States, had the opportunity to have one of those completely free of charge and to drive it as much as they possibly could in 3 months. One participant said his family put 14,000 miles on this car in 3 months. Not only that, but again, any repair they would just do for you for free, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to figure out, like, what kind of problems are we going to have if we put this car into production. And so it's said that every car had at least one engine put in it. and some of them multiple engines. And the reason for it was not because the engines were bad. In fact, what they found was that the engines were far more reliable than a regular engine of the day. Well, the problem was is people didn't know how to operate it very well, and so they would end up destroying it through their negligence. But that's actually what they wanted to find out. They wanted to find out, like, how are people going to destroy this thing so we can make it so that people can't do that? So this went on for about 3 years. And everywhere that people would take these cars, it would draw a crowd. They said if you were not a people person, this was not the car for you. Because if you would go anywhere, if you would stop it at the gas station, no matter where you went, going to the store, going to a restaurant, there would be a crowd of people because this car sounded and looked completely different from any other car of the day. And so everywhere you went, you would just be inundated by people who wanted to understand, to see, to hear this car. Well, interestingly enough, they went through this program for like 3 years. They had this loaner program going on. And then the loaner program ended, and they wanted to give the cars away to museums because they couldn't just give them to people because they weren't going to support them any longer. And so but they didn't want to destroy them. And only about 5 museums would take the car. And so the rest of the cars, over 50 cars, were destroyed. By 1981, this engine was still in development, and when Chrysler hit the financial skids in 1981, they shut down the program, and the car had never gone into production. It was a failure. In fact, it was probably one of the most expensive failures and the longest programs to ever exist in a car company that ended up failing, because Chrysler had actually started developing the turbine engine in the late 1930s. Almost 50 years of development gone. That's a pretty big failure. We're going to talk about what was even bigger failure here in Matthew chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26, we're dealing with a situation where Peter, the apostle, has just witnessed Jesus, who he has admitted or confessed is the Christ. He has just watched him be arrested. And while Peter probably saw the Christ as somebody who was going to be a political leader, somebody who would be the new King David, who would restore the fortunes of the kingdom of Israel, he has now fallen into the hands of the Romans and of the religious leaders, and his life will be lost. And Peter has said to Jesus that he will never leave him. And even if he has to die, he will never leave him. But Jesus had predicted to Peter that he would deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. And in Matthew chapter 26, verse 73, it says, "After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you.' Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know the man.'" Now, when it says he began to invoke a curse on himself, that word is basically he damned himself. He basically said, "May I be damned, may I be sent to hell if I was with that guy." There is no greater betrayal that Peter could have given. There's no more greater lack of standing with Jesus that he could have done than to say, "May I go straight to hell if I knew that man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Peter here is dealing with the biggest failure of his life, and possibly the biggest failure that any human being could undertake, to deny Jesus. And yet we know that this won't be the end for Peter. How is it that Peter can endure such a failure and end up being a rock? How can he be such a pivotal part of the church and the beginning of the church after such a failure? We're going to look at the theology of failure today. And we're going to look at it in three areas. We're going to look at, first of all, being an acceptable or having an acceptable sacrifice. And then we're going to look at the avoidance of failure, how we try to orient our lives in order to miss out on as much failure as possible. And then finally, we're going to talk about love and the Spirit. So let's first look at an acceptable sacrifice. I think the reality is that all of us at times in our lives, we feel like failures. And some of us are much more acutely aware of our failures than others. But all of us at some point feel like a failure. Now, the problem is that we're actually much bigger failures than any of us actually know. That's the good news. Does it make us happy today? Is this good? This is what you came here today for, right? We're actually bigger failures than we know. The problem is that in order to deal with our failures, we engage the fig leaf. The fig leaf is hiding behind some kind of surface success in order to get around our failures, or even sometimes redefining the nature of success so that we weren't the failures we thought we were. Have you guys ever done that? You know, you head off to do something and then you don't make it, so that you just redefine what you were actually after, so that now it's actually success, right? So hopefully you guys noticed our carpet's done. Well, not exactly done. See, I redefined success there. It's done. That's what we were aiming for. No, we had a big crew of people. Thank you to all the people who helped out yesterday. We worked really hard. We got the carpet done back there, but we need to bring it up here, but we need to redo the stage up here first, and so there's going to be a lot of stuff. But we have goals, we have plans, we have things that we're trying to do here. And you know what? Not every one of them is going to come out great. And in fact, as the day was ending, I was cutting carpet around different things. The problem is that the middle part of the carpet's easy. But when you get to the edges and you have to cut around beams and you have to cut around doorways and you have to cut around trim and all that kind of stuff, that's when it gets really difficult. And Jordan McAllister did this part by the door over here. I'm going to call her out because she did such a great job. I mean, it looks perfect. And all the other parts that don't look perfect, that's what I did. And I found myself redefining success as I got tireder and tireder, right? Have you guys ever done that in a project? Like, as you get tired, you're like, oh, that's good enough, right? And you can see, if you look closely, you can look around and you can see my redefinition of success as it went down, as I just lost energy. But we do that, don't we? We try to redefine success. We try to look at some surface level to say, really, I'm not as big of a failure as I might seem. But the reality is that when we get down into it, especially when we look at our hearts, we fail all the time. David, who was known as a man after God's own heart, had amazing failures in his life. In Psalm chapter 51, verse 3 through 5, it says, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." David's saying, even though I'm a man after God's own heart, when I look at my life, what sits in front of my face? My failure. He continues on in verse 4, "Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." He's saying, look, from the very beginning, there's been failure in my life. How is it that somebody who can have the kind of failures that David had in his life and be aware of those failures, how can he continue to seek after God? What is God's purpose for failure in our lives, and how should we handle it? Well, if we look back to the Old Testament, and the Old Testament sacrificial system, it's really interesting because it really teaches us what failure is for and how it's dealt with. Because really, what that system is doing is it's dealing with sin, and sin is a failure. So let's look at Leviticus chapter 1, verse 3. And Leviticus has to deal with the Levitical priesthood and all the laws and the rules and regulations. And you think to yourself, well, why do we need such a book? And if you've ever read through the book of Leviticus, you will say to yourself at some point in that experience, why do we need such a book? Right? Because basically it's like reading the tax code. It's basically reading this list of rules and laws, and you think, why is this necessary? Well, it's really interesting why it's necessary. It's necessary because the way that failure is dealt with is very specific. In order to deal with failure, you have to understand what failure is, what its purpose is, and how you get out of it. And Leviticus, with all of its intricacies, its rules, its regulations, is kind of trying to teach us something about that. Leviticus chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord." What's he saying here? He's saying that there's a very specific way that when you go to approach God because of the sin in your life, because of all the failure in your life, there is a very specific set of steps. There's a very specific order. There's a very specific number of things that you must do in order to be in the presence of God. And you can't fudge those. Because if you fudge those, you're not really dealing with the failure. You're just throwing a fig leaf over it. And in fact, that was a big problem with Israel when God brought them out of the wilderness and Moses said, "Here's the laws, here's what we're going to do." They changed the relationship of the people with the sacrificial system. You see, before, when they were in Egypt, if you were the father of a household, then your job was to bring the sacrifices before God, and you could kind of do it the way that you wanted to do it. But what happened is that when God brought Israel out of Egypt, he said, "No, that's not going to happen anymore. That's not good enough anymore. You need to do it in this specific way." Only the priests can do it, because only the priests have the training to do it the correct way. And they have to do it the correct way, or they could die. And they have to be dressed appropriately, and they have to go through the steps. And not only that, but the offering that you bring has to be a without blemish offering, perfect. You have to bring a perfect offering if you're going to deal with your failure. Now, why is that important? In Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 20, it says, "What use to me is frankincense that comes from Sheba, or sweet cane from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable, nor your sacrifices pleasing to me." In Jeremiah, it's actually saying that this bringing an acceptable offering is actually more difficult than you think, because not only do you need to do all the steps right and have all the stuff right, but your attitude has to be right. Your heart has to be right. Otherwise, your sacrifice is just not acceptable. It doesn't do the job. So why is this? Because the relationship that you have with God and the relationship that you have with everything else, but ultimately, primarily the relationship that you have with God, is the context of valuing. We trade value with one another, and we do that in the context of relationship. But it's not just with each other, it's actually with everything. With everything you encounter, you end up having a relationship of trading value. And sometimes, if you have the wrong sacrifice, when you trade value with things, you will experience a failure that is small. But if you're dealing with God and you don't bring the right sacrifice, you don't trade with Him value in the appropriate way, that's a major problem. Well, what do I mean by that? Relationship is just basically, when we say relationship, what we just mean is that there's an exchange that's going on. Now, the problem is that a lot of times we don't realize that that's what's happening, but I'll tell you that it's true. Let me give you the example that's pretty easy. How many of you guys drove here in a car today? Anyone? A few of you drove here in a car today? Do you have a relationship with that car? Are you guys buddies? You're just like this? Me and my car, you got pictures together, right? Here we are on vacation, right? No, the thing is that you have a relationship with that car. You do, right? Because you're exchanging value with that car. Now, let me show you how this works. How many of you guys, when you were growing up and you got your license, had a parent tell you that you need to check the oil in your engine? Anyone? You had somebody tell you that? I've known people who've driven cars and were not told that. And they didn't. And the engine seized. What happens when your engine seizes? right? Here's the thing. You have a relationship with a car where your car is serving you. It's glorifying you because it's transporting you. You remember when you got your license, just the freedom you felt? Do you guys remember that? Like, you take it for granted now, but when you were a kid and all of a sudden you could drive, it opened up the world to you. This car is glorifying you. And in fact, what's interesting is in the Old Testament, the word for cow and the word for throne is the same word because people were enthroned on the domestic animals. That was their throne. Why? Because it glorified them. It allowed them to do things that they couldn't do before. A cow allowed you to plow with the oxen. They allowed you to plow your field. And donkeys and horses allowed you to go. That was kind of their car. And the idea was that they were enthroned on these things because it glorified them. And now we don't do that with animals so much, but we do it with cars. The car is glorifying you. But what do you have to do in exchange? Is there an exchange that needs to happen? Of course there is. If you don't put gas in the car, if you don't put oil in the car, if you don't give an offering, if you don't value it, it will cease to value you. And that's true in every relationship with everything that you come into contact with. The turbine car, one of the things that there was an 8-step starting process. You know what? People aren't good at that. And so one of the things that they realized is that most of the engines were being burned up because people weren't following the startup procedure. And so they realized that they needed to do something to make it simpler. Why? Because people weren't able to value the car in the way that they needed to be valued. You see, this takes us to something really important. Not all sacrifices are acceptable. Any of you guys ever have your car break down and you go out to fix it? So for Father's Day, happy Father's Day, everyone. For Father's Day, if you're dad, we have gifts out there for you, and they're generally tools. And the reason for it, and just go pick one up after the service. We also, by the way, this is a good time to announce that, after church today, we have root beer floats. Yay. Why? Because Dad's root beer. Get it? See the connection? So here's the thing. How many of you guys your car broke down and you go out to fix it? Anyone? You go out to fix it? How many of you guys were successful in that? Sometimes not. Here's the thing. I remember when I was in college, I was cheap, and I never wanted to take my car to a mechanic, and so I would always go out to fix it, and about 30% of the time I would succeed, but 70% of the time I wouldn't. Why? Because I wasn't bringing an acceptable sacrifice. You see, the mechanic had spent maybe 10 or 20 years sacrificing his time to learn how to properly value a car, how to properly maintain it, how to properly fix it. And I had not made that sacrifice. And so I could go out and I could try to fix the car, but it wasn't the proper sacrifice. It wasn't an acceptable sacrifice. And so there are times when you bring an acceptable sacrifice, and there are times when you don't. But not all sacrifices are acceptable. You see, what the problem is here is that Peter is trying to value his relationship with Jesus, but not bring an acceptable sacrifice. And this is something that all of us have to be aware of. Peter is saying, Jesus, I will never leave you. But what Peter is willing to bring, the sacrifice that he's willing to bring, is not his life. Because when his life is on the line, when Peter realizes that he could die alongside Jesus, it's too much of a sacrifice for him. He will not make that sacrifice, and so he has to face the failure of not being with the Lord that he's pledged himself to. He fears making too large of a sacrifice, giving too much of himself. And a lot of times that's exactly where we're at. We fear that. And the reason for it is really important to understand, because there are two types of failures. And this is really important for us to understand. There's two types of failures. And a lot of times we don't know which type we're facing And that creates a lot of problems for us. Let me tell you what the two types of failures are. There's failures to make an acceptable sacrifice, but then there's also making too great a sacrifice for something that's not worth it. Right? You guys know that this is the case, don't you? Because the thing is like, have you ever gone to the mechanic and he says, hey, it's going to be $4,000 to fix your car? And you say, that car's not worth $4,000. That isn't going to happen. Or sometimes it's right on the line, and then you're struggling. What are you struggling with? You're struggling with which type of failure is confronting you. Is it my reluctance to put $4,000 into the car to make the appropriate sacrifice? Or is it the fact that the car is not worth $4,000? Sometimes it's right on the line. You can't decide which it is. That's where Peter's at. See, Peter doesn't know whether Jesus is worth the sacrifice. Is Peter in danger of making too great a sacrifice for something that's not worth it? Or is Peter in danger of not offering a good enough sacrifice? And either way, it's catastrophic. The results are going to be catastrophic. So think about going into a casino and losing all your money. You've made a big sacrifice, but it's not worth it. You see, not everything, you're in a relationship with everything around you, and there is an appropriate level to sacrifice with all the things in your life. The question is, where do you put God in that? This is the question that all of us have to face. That's what Peter is facing. Where is Jesus in this? Is Jesus worth the greatest possible sacrifice, or is he just another thing in my life? And you need to know this, because at some point you're going to be called on to give the ultimate sacrifice. Every one of us, when we die, we have to decide, do we trust in Jesus? Will he be who he said he was? Will he bring us through this thing that we've never faced before? God teaches us through our failures. So let's look at, secondly, the avoidance of failure, because the thing is that what a lot of us do when faced with these types of questions is we just try to avoid the failure altogether. The problem is that when we avoid failure, we avoid learning. See, God teaches us through our failures exactly how we should be valuing things. Right? How many of you guys can look back at your life and say, I made a sacrifice that was too great for something? How many of you guys can do that? Right? You can look back at your life at some point. Maybe you got a degree and you didn't really benefit from it. Right? Maybe that happened. Maybe you got into a relationship, and that relationship was with somebody who didn't value you, and so it ended up not being worthwhile in your life. Maybe you bought something that, looking back, you should have never bought it. How many of you guys remember when you bought your first house and you thought to yourself, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Right? So the thing is that all of us can look at the fact that when we're faced with failure, what's happening is, when we have that experience of failure, we can see that God is actually trying to teach us something. And it's either something about the fact that we have not been willing to give up enough of ourselves, or that we have given too much of ourselves to the wrong thing. But those are experiences that are incredibly painful. And I don't know who I'm talking to today, or well, I know who I'm talking to, but I don't know where you're at in your life. But I imagine that there's probably some people here today that the pain of experiencing failure has made you lose hope. Because I'm not talking about small, I'm talking about deep in your gut, like questioning yourself and if you're worthwhile as a person. I'm talking about deep in your gut, you don't know if there's any hope for you at all. You don't know if there's any hope in God at all. But I can tell you that the failures that you've experienced, that God has a blessing in them if you have the ears to hear those blessings. So we oftentimes, because of the pain of failure, we avoid the risk of failure and the risk of sacrifice. Let me give you a good example from Scripture of this. In 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 10 and 11, it says, Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you shall be clean." Now this is directions given to a guy named Naaman. Now Naaman is a guy from a foreign country, and he's a big deal, right? He has one of those T-shirts, "I'm kind of a big deal." You know, he's a big deal. And so he brings all kinds of, he brings like a treasure trove with him. And he's got leprosy, and he wants to be cured of this. And he's heard that in Israel, there's a man of God that can cure him. And so he brings like enough money with him that he can be cured of this, because he wants to be done with this. This is a terrible affliction to have in any circumstance. But back in this day and age, it was basically an ostracism from all of society. And he's got a very important place in the government of his country. And so he goes to Elisha, this holy man that he's heard about. And he wants to know, can I be healed of this? And the answer is yes, you can be healed of it. Well, what do I need to do? What sacrifice needs to be made? I got all this money, I got all this stuff. It says Elisha sent a message to him saying, "Go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you shall be clean." Now here's the thing. This is a price that he was not expecting, and one that he is not willing to pay. And you say, well, why is that? If he's willing to bring boatloads of money, why wouldn't he be willing to dip himself in the Jordan? Because this is the one thing that costs him the most. This is humiliating. In verse 11 it says, "But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, 'Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leprosy.' I thought that the money was going to take care of it. And he would stand here, he would call upon God, he would wave it all around. But instead, I got to get in this stupid, muddy, disgusting river when we have much better rivers at home. I'm not about to humiliate myself in this pond scum-laden, muddy, terrible river." Do you think that it was a coincidence that Elisha told him this is the price to be paid? He doesn't want to look like a fool. He doesn't want to be humiliated. He doesn't want to dip himself in some muddy river 7 times just to be laughed at. And he won't be laughed at. You see, it's interesting that in order to avoid failure, to be humiliated, it's interesting that the price can be too high when it's seemingly so low. Avoiding the pain and failure through the fig leaf of, "I'm a rich man, I've got so much. I'm way above this." Like the rich young ruler who says, "I've kept the law." You see, the interesting thing is that we all get to build our life, but it's negotiated with God. Every one of us here gets to build our own life. Isn't that an amazing thing? That basically God says to you, "Look, what do you want your life to be? You can build it." But here's the interesting catch to that, is that the price that we pay is the price that God sets. And not all of us are willing to pay that price. Do you want to be an astronaut? Go ahead. There's a price to be paid. Do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to be a surgeon? Go ahead. There's a price to be paid. You can be whatever you want. The problem is that it's not just up to you. It's a negotiation. You decide what you want, and God tells you what the price is. And if you're not willing to pay the price, you experience failure. Why is it that so many of us go to the fig leaf? Because we want the life that we want, but we're unwilling to pay the price. Do you want to be the greatest father for your children? You can be. You have to pay the price. Do you want to be a guy that can be counted on, can be relied on? Do you want to be somebody who's successful? Do you want to be somebody who's able to be a blessing to the people around him? Do you want to be you can be, but you have to pay the price. You get to build your life, but there's an amount that's due. And the reality is that when it gets right down to it, all of us are unable to pay the full price of success. Not one of us is able to pay the full price of success. The real lesson of this is that you can't make the appropriate sacrifice. Say you want to be a doctor. You want to be the best doctor that there is. You're going to pay the price for that. But you don't want to neglect your family. And so you want to be the best husband you can be. And then you also want to be the best father you can be. You know what? Here's the thing. You start adding up all the costs of the life that you want. You can't pay that price. It's too much for you. In fact, any one of those things in reality is too much for you. In fact, simply having the relationship with God that you really want is a price that's too big for you to pay. In John chapter 15, verse 4, it says, "Abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." Unless you ultimately put your hope in Jesus and the price that He paid, you can't have the relationship with God that you need and that you want. You could not pay a price high enough. Just like Peter, what you'll find is that your desire is high enough. You say, "Jesus, I love you," but in the end, you'll find that while the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. You can't make the right sacrifice because you don't have enough love. So let's talk about number 3, love in the Spirit. What's really fascinating when you look at this failure of Peter's is that there's an amazing transformation. Like, you read a few chapters on, and you can't believe it's the same guy. Peter is a failure at the crucifixion of Jesus, but 50 days later, he's standing up in front of all Jerusalem. You remember when, a little slave girl came to Peter and said, "Hey, weren't you that guy that was with him?" He's like, "No!" A slave girl scares Peter away from his commitment to Christ. 50 days later, Peter is standing before all of Jerusalem, and he's preaching to them. And he says this in verse 36 of Acts chapter 2. "Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." Peter is not only standing up there saying, "I am a follower of Jesus," he's saying to all of Jerusalem that the one you've been waiting for, the guy who was the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah, has come, and you all killed him. Do you think that that's a popular thing to say? This guy who was previously afraid, 50 days later, would be preaching this message. You see, here's the thing that's important for us to understand. Why is it that you won't pay the price? Why won't you make the necessary sacrifice? And the reason is because you don't love enough. Let me make that very clear, and this might be something that's hard for you to hear. The reason that you won't make the appropriate sacrifice is because you don't love enough. Love is the motivation for sacrifice. Because when you love something, it doesn't even feel like a sacrifice when you're doing something on its behalf. You know, the interesting thing is I said everything's an exchange, but it only feels like an exchange when it's going wrong. Right? How many of you guys thought about your car today when you were coming here and thought about the fact that, hey, you know what? I have to make an exchange with this thing. I have to put gas in it. I have to make the insurance payments. I have to get the oil change. I have to repair it. You thought about that when you started up the car and you drove it. Most of us didn't, right? We just get in the car and we go. When do you think about it? When it breaks down by the side of the road. Something's gone wrong in the exchange. Now I'm thinking about it. You see, the thing that's interesting is that the more love that you have for something, the less you think about it. You know what's interesting? Jay Leno owns one of the 5 remaining turbine cars. And he would drive it around all the time. And he burned up the engine. And there's no parts to get. And so he found a group of guys that worked for this small jet engine place that were willing to, in their off hours, the guy that owns the company said that they could use all the tools and all the equipment of the company. And these people decided that they would put in their hours. And Jay Leno, said that he would cover all the cost of parts and all that kind of stuff, materials. And he is going to rebuild this car because there's only 5 of them. And you know what's interesting? The cost doesn't seem to matter to him. Why? Because he loves the car so much that when it comes back, he doesn't think, oh, look at the cost. He thinks, oh, what does this thing need? You see, the reality is that we don't love enough. Do you remember when that curse was given in the garden? And God said that through the sweat of your brow, that work was going to be toilsome through the sweat of your brow. Why is work toilsome? Because we no longer love the earth, we love ourselves. The thing is, when a farmer goes out to his field, he doesn't say, I love this land so much, I want to make it productive. He says to himself, how much can I grow this year? How much is it going to pay? How much, right? We think of ourselves when we're in these exchanges. Because we don't love enough. The transactional nature of the relationship, which is invisible when it's working, becomes visible to us, and all we think about is what's being required of us, what sacrifice is going to make us be successful. The reality is that when Peter stands up in front of all Jerusalem, the Spirit of God is in him. And because the Spirit of God is in him, he's now willing to make the sacrifice. And he will make the sacrifice. Peter will be killed for his faith. He will die for Jesus. Because the Spirit of God is in him, working in him to love what he should love in the amount that he should love it. The failure of the turbine car is an interesting lesson. Chrysler put all this money into this program, and you think, well, it failed. But the interesting thing is that when this turbine car finally was out and they were doing this program of letting people drive it, for those 3 years, what's interesting is the market share of Chrysler doubled from 8% to 16%. Why? Because everybody wanted to buy a car from the company who could do this. Not only that, has anybody ever heard of the M1 tank? So the tanks that we use in the United States, it's the M1 Abrams tank. It has a turbine engine. It was developed by a company named Chrysler Defense. All the guys who worked on the turbine car, they went and worked for Chrysler Defense. Because what they realized is they couldn't get the cost down, but they knew somebody with deep pockets. It's actually a relative of mine, Uncle Sam. There was a kid that was part of this program. His dad was signed up for this and got the use of this car for 3 months. And because he was over 16, he got to drive it everywhere he wanted to. And he said the thing that was crazy is that he was incredibly shy. He's kind of a big, kind of awkward-looking guy. He was incredibly shy. And he said having that car for 3 months, he became incredibly outgoing because everybody wanted to talk to him, and he learned that he could talk to people. The designers and the builders of this car, the ones that are still alive, were actually involved in fixing Jay Leno's car because they said that being a part of this program was the greatest time of their life. You see, what's interesting is something that appears to be a failure can be redeemed. When the Spirit comes in our lives, when we're finally humble enough to say, I can't make the sacrifice. Jesus, I need you. Then the failures in our lives can be redeemed. We talk a lot about believing, belonging, becoming. And there's a transformation in our spirit that's necessary for us to believe and to belong and to become. We need the Spirit in us to let God train us through our failure. to be humbled and to rely on Him in order to transform our lives so that we can have the love necessary to avoid failures in the futures. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, it says, "For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." My encouragement to you today is let your failure make you humble. Let it lead you to rely on Christ, who has made the only sacrifice that's necessary for us to have the Spirit of God in us and be taught by that Spirit through all of your successes and all your failures to love things rightly.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.